So, get this. How can one single, ignored instruction end up costing a country over $40 million in public money? It sounds crazy, right? Well, today we're breaking down a court case from Papua New Guinea where that's exactly what happened, and it cost a very senior official his entire career. Let's get into it.
So it all kicks off with this number, 41.8 million kina. I mean, that is just a staggering amount of public money, and it's right at the center of this whole story. The way this money was spent, well, it triggered a criminal conviction that went all the way to the highest court in the land.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. Those are the exact words from the nation's top judge, Chief Justice Sir Gibbs Salika, the one who handed down the final verdict. You know, his words really set the stage for how serious this whole thing was. He's framing the gravity of what we're about to get into.
So, the big question is, who was held responsible for all this? Well, we're talking about the former Deputy Finance Secretary, a man named Jacob Yafai. And after a pretty long trial, the court came back with a very decisive verdict on what he did while he was in one of the most powerful jobs in the entire public service.
And yeah, that's the final outcome right there. Guilty. On all 5 counts. But to really get what happened here, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to look at exactly what he was charged with and, how the court actually got to that conclusion. It's a really fascinating look at accountability and the whole idea of a chain of command. Okay, so the prosecution's entire case was built around a series of 4 really specific payments, and they were all made to the very same recipient over, about 8 months? Let's break it down.
So the whole case was focused on 4 massive payments, all going to one single law firm, Paul Paraka Lawyers. And you can see, we're talking tens of millions of kina paid out in just a matter of months. Each one of those transfers became its own separate charge of misappropriation.
Right, and then you have the 5th charge. This one was a bit different. It was for abuse of office, and it wasn't about just one payment. It kind of rolled up the entire K41.8 million into one big charge. The argument was that Yafai had illegally used his powerful position to make all 4 of those payments happen.
So you might be wondering, what exactly is misappropriation? Well, in this context, it basically means a public official dishonestly used the state's money for somebody else's benefit. In this case, the law firm. And that word, dishonestly, that's the word the court really zeroed in on. It was key. And this brings us to the absolute heart of the legal fight. The whole trial really boiled down to this one fundamental question. Was Jacob Yafai just following orders from his bosses, or did he completely neglect a fundamental duty that came with his job? I mean, the whole case hung on these 2 totally opposing arguments. On one side, you have the defense saying, look, Yafai wasn't being dishonest, he was just doing what he was told by his superiors. But on the other side, the prosecution argued that it didn't matter what orders he got, he had a professional duty to verify the payments, and choosing not to do that, that was the dishonest act. So how in the world does a court decide something like that? Well, the verdict actually came down to one single piece of evidence, the so-called smoking gun that proved Yafai had a personal duty to check these payments.
So what was it? What was this key piece of evidence that totally blew up the defense's whole just following orders argument? Well, it wasn't some secret recording or a surprise witness or anything like that. It was just a letter, but a letter with some very clear handwritten instructions on it.
And here it is. This is the actual letter from Paul Paraka Lawyers asking for payment. But the thing that turned this simple piece of paper into the trial's most critical exhibit, it was the notes. The notes scribbled on it as it made its way up the chain of command at the Department of Finance. The proof was right there, in the handwriting. First, the finance minister himself wrote a really clear instruction for his secretary: peruse, verify, and settle. Then, that secretary passed the letter down to his deputy, Yafai, adding his own note that hammered the point home: verify, confirm, settle. So that order to check the facts, it was passed directly down the line.
And for the Chief Justice, one little word stood out above everything else: verify. The judge himself said it. The entire outcome of the case hinged on whether or not Mr. Yafai had actually done what that one word commanded him to do.
And look, to verify a government legal bill, that's not just a suggestion. It's an official, mandatory process. It's called vetting. And what it means is that the Solicitor General's office has to review the claim to make sure it's legit before a single kina gets paid out. But here's the kicker. According to testimony from someone at the Department of Justice, that whole vetting process, it was completely skipped. The claims were never even sent over for review. And what's even more damning is that a state witness testified that the law firm, Paul Paraka Lawyers, had already been paid in full for their work. They weren't actually owed any more money by the state. So you see, if that verification had just happened, it would have stopped these payments dead in their tracks.
So once it was established that this failure to verify was the central fact of the case, the court was ready to make its final judgment. And the Chief Justice was clear. Yafai's failure wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a dishonest application of state funds.
And the court's final ruling was, well, it was methodical. It was crystal clear. They laid out the findings for each of the 5 charges, one by one.
And the verdict? It was a complete clean sweep for the prosecution. On all 4 counts of misappropriation, the finding was exactly the same: guilty. And on that final charge of abusing his office, you guessed it, guilty as charged.
In his final remarks, the Chief Justice brought everything right back to that one simple instruction. He said, and I'm quoting him here, "The outcome of the case depended on whether Mr. Jacob Yafai verified the claims. Mr. Yafai failed and cost the people of this country dearly." Wow. I mean, that's such a powerful summary of how one failure of due diligence led to this massive, massive financial loss for an entire country. And all this really leaves us with a huge question, one that goes way beyond this one courtroom in Papua New Guinea. In any organization, right, in any chain of command, where is that line? When does just following orders stop and your personal professional responsibility to check the facts, to ask questions, and to protect the public interest, when does that take over? It's definitely something to think about.